Hello and welcome to episode 60 of the Filmumentaries podcast. It's Jamie Benning here. It's the end of October 2022. Thanks for joining me again for another hour or so of film history chat. If you're new to the podcast, there are, of course, 59 more great episodes for you to dive into, in which I chat to innovators, editors, directors, puppeteers, stunt performers, model makers, VFX legends. In fact, talking of VFX legends, I have some news on that front. I've managed to secure a date with the grandfather of modern VFX, Dennis Muren. Dennis Muren, I know, amazing. That will be one of the episodes for November 2022. I'm very excited to be able to talk to Dennis. You know, he's one of the true kind of icons of the industry. Apologies for being late on October's episodes. Again, it's a very busy time for me with work. Lots of family stuff, plus adding the final touches to a Kickstarter campaign for a documentary I've been working on. More exciting news on that very soon, but we intend to launch it in early November, and the we I refer to is myself and co-collaborator Patrick Tyndall, Paddy Tyndall. Paddy and I have worked together for Formula One for many years. We've been friends for a long time. We've also made several other projects together, including the short documentaries on Yoda puppeteer Dave Barkley, producer Robert Watts, and producer-writer Ivor Powell, all of which, by the way, are still available for you to watch for free on my Vimeo channel. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Back to the business of this episode. So back in December 2021, I spoke with author John Walsh about his book, Escape from New York, The Official Story of the Film. That was episode 41, if I remember correctly, and he's been busy beavering away on a new book, Doctor Who and the Daleks, The Official Story of the Films. Films, because there were, of course, two of them. If you don't know about them, check them out. Both star Peter Cushing as the Doctor. I remember watching these on Channel 4 in the early 90s in widescreen. They put a load of stuff out in widescreen at one point. They're odd films, but they're also pretty great. It's like an alternative universe version of Doctor Who. So I spoke to John earlier this month, October 2022. There will also be a video version of this interview on my YouTube channel. This is what patrons of £3 and above get. So when my guests allow it, I do a video version and I put it on my YouTube channel or my Vimeo channel. So you can check out this one for free, just to give you a little taster. So here's my chat with author John Walsh about his new book, Doctor Who and the Daleks, The Official Story of the Films. And I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on.
Now set the controls for anywhere in time and space that we wish to go. When I push that lever, this room and everything in it will dissolve into their respective component electrical charges. We're all made up of them. These charges will then be transferred in time and space and reassembled in their proper order and their proper place.
So John, last time I spoke to you for your book on Escape from New York, that doesn't seem that long ago, and since then you've managed to write another book, Doctor Who and the Daleks, The Official Story of the Films. How did that come about? What was the period of time between those two books, or were you writing both simultaneously? How did it come about?
Well, hi Jamie, great to be back on. Thank you for having me. Pretty much the conversation with the publisher continued, and this is owned by the same rights holder, so Studio Canal, or Canal Plus as it used to be called years ago. So the great French company who are now, I think, either the third or fourth biggest film library on the planet Earth. So Doctor Who and the Daleks I knew was in their catalogue for some time, and I said to my publisher, can I write that around the time of Flash Gordon, because that's also a Canal property. And they thought there wouldn't be a big enough market for it. So it's always been on the back burner. And of course, this year, Studio Canal did their wonderful 4K restorations of both movies. And so the conversation naturally came back round again. So between me, Tyson Books and Studio Canal, that those wheels are always sort of turning. And rather boastfully, I'm going to say, in the time that we last spoke, I finished another book as well. So Conan the Barbarian, the official story of the film, not for Studio Canal but for Tyson Books, is out in August 23. So they've held that back. It was going to be this year, but they've held it back to next year. So fascinating that I've become this sort of accidental author, mostly in lockdown, and I'm about to start work on book number 6.
Amazing. Book 6. I mean, yeah, when you started it in lockdown, it was just a sort of reaction to, well, the situation that so many of us were in, where our work disappeared completely. We couldn't really do anything. and you've decided to go down this route, and it seems like you were destined for it in many ways.
Well, I think the route kind of found me. So after the Harryhausen book in September 19, I thought that's my first and last big sort of coffee table art book. And the conversation kind of continued. I think Flash Gordon would have happened, and lockdown came along at the time when Flash Gordon was going to happen anyway. But there was a momentum with lockdown where people were in spaces where they could be found, like on Zoom, and I could kind of concentrate without having to meet people at Patisserie Valerie for lunch, which is a favourite haunt of mine, and producer types, which I'm mostly a producer more than a director in the sense that more of my hours, if I was to allocate them off at the pearly gates, they say you spend more time producing than directing because you spend more time setting up your own projects. So it was almost a relief not to meet people at length in town and get on with the books. And they started to have a momentum. When they started selling well, it was always the next book. But Doctor Who and Conan were written almost overlapping. So that was not the plan, but that's how things worked out. But it's been great because the response to Doctor Who and to even the advance on Conan has been very positive.
And how did you manage to sort of delineate between the two? I know when you're researching for multiple projects, sometimes you can get, or I can get a bit mixed up with who was involved with what. Did you have two very separate delineated folders and things, or even laptops or anything like that?
Yeah, it's basically my geek brain. I've been such a big Doctor Who fan since forever, and the movies as well. I've had all of these. Instead of having my mortgage account number or my PIN number in my brain, I've always had the questions about Doctor Who. Why was it like this? And why did they do that? And if I ever got the chance to write a book. So really, the spine of the Doctor Who book was in me already. With Conan, I knew that film quite well too, and I'm a big fan of Dino De Laurentiis. And a bit like Flash Gordon, if you know that film well, and you knew there was problems with the actors and the effects and so on, but there is another story to tell, and we found that out with the Nicholas Roeg version published for the first time in my book. For Conan, there's an Oliver Stone version of Conan the Barbarian that didn't happen in the 70s. And so I've got hold of that version, and Ed Pressman, the producer of that version, and basically teased out what the story would have been. So that's here for the first time. Teased out the story of what went very wrong. So why Oliver Stone didn't direct and Ed Pressman didn't produce on his own. Why it was handed over to Dino De Laurentiis. And fascinatingly, Jim Danforth, who is a sort of well-known special effects animator who'd worked with Ray Harryhausen and in his own right on lots of science fiction films and television, he allowed me to reproduce his artwork, his production art, from the unmade Oliver Stone version of Conan the Barbarian. And it's those sorts of things that get publishers excited and readers excited, and me, because I'm thinking, I don't want this to be like a DVD insert booklet in hardback. It has to be so much more than that. It has to be more than screenshots and a few vague essays. It needs to say something new and also present the official version, because like a true crimes podcast, although no one's in prison yet for any of the books I've written, they do become that sort of public record. The rights holder gets behind them and sort of approves and said, yes, what John is saying here is the official version. So I've noticed other books popping up, the official Harry Potter cookbook. It's like, oh, weren't using the word official before Flash Gordon, but we'll let that go.
But it's amazing, isn't it, that these films that we've loved and watched for so many years, we initially loved the film, and we might love the comic or the novelization, or there might have been sequels, and then we get into the making of documentaries, and there's still these layers and layers and layers for us to dig into. And what you've done with this book, Doctor Who and the Daleks, the official story of the films, is great, because these two films I didn't even know existed until I guess it was the 90s when they were shown on Channel 4 in widescreen, and I suddenly thought, Peter Cushing was Doctor Who, or the Doctor, I should say, although he does call himself Doctor Who, of course, in that movie, as your book rightly says. What is amazing about this is it's kind of anomalous, isn't it? These two films are kind of anomalous in that the TV series had been running for a couple of years at this point, and then along comes this movie, and it changed people's perceptions of the Doctor. Maybe didn't fit quite with what had been there previously in the TV series. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so interestingly, if we go back, 1963, November 63 is when William Hartnell first appeared as the Doctor, as you're quite right to say, Jamie, the Doctor on television. And he's an alien, but he's come to the planet Earth in a TARDIS that he's stolen, a time machine he's stolen, with someone he calls his granddaughter Susan. So that much is established from the television series. The movie version, or the film version, as we should say, from 1965 has Peter Cushing playing his version of William Hartnell. So there hadn't been a regeneration on screen until November 66, after the second Doctor Who movie had already been in cinemas. So Peter Cushing didn't know, oh, I could have plucked anything and been another version or another regeneration. But could you? Because your character is called Doctor Who in the way that he might be Mr. Smith. Hello, I'm Doctor Who. And also he's human. And he's on Earth, he's earthbound, and he's built this time machine in his back garden with his very young granddaughter Susan, who is kind of a child prodigy. So very different setup from the television series. And as a result of that, because he's not considered to be canon, over many years, certainly in the 70s and 80s, the Peter Cushing films stood rather separately from the BBC series. And of course, it's not owned by the BBC. It was owned by British Lion Films and Milton Subotsky's film company, he was the American producer, who came over to the UK and tried to sort of rival Hammer Films and making horror anthology films. So it's fascinating because this was a time when television series becoming feature films was kind of finding its legs, and Doctor Who really kicked it off. So you fast forward to sort of the early 1970s and you've got an On the Buses movie that makes more money at the UK box office than Diamonds Are Forever.
Yeah, I mean, I think of, there was a period in time when, I don't know whether it was in school holidays or what, but I suddenly became aware of all these adaptations of old series that my parents would have watched, like On the Buses, and there was even the Cannon of Ball movie and all those sorts of things. But this was quite new in as much as I think in your book you say that the Quatermass experiment was the first of that kind that had gone from TV to film.
Yes, and I think because Quatermass kind of existed as mini-series on television, the transition for viewers probably didn't seem that unusual to go to feature film and so on, in the way that Day of the Triffids has kind of been television and cinema and so on. But this was unusual for Doctor Who because it was a current series and it kept running. But at the time when Milton got the licence rather cheaply, the BBC didn't know it was going to be running for years and years and hadn't maybe regarded it with the... they didn't regard it as the jewel in the drama crown as it is today, and would later become in the sort of the early 70s as well. It became hot property then. And I think Milton, his two films in the 60s stand as kind of standard bearers because nobody else, despite the numerous attempts by well-known and not so well-known people, tried to get the films in cinemas again, and it never happened. There's in fact a book out there about the unmade films that are not to do with these two from Studio Canal. So it's quite a laborious process to try and get the rights for something. And today, when we look at streaming services, they're either doing animated versions of live action films or live action versions of classic animation, because if you can say to people it's that thing from the telly but a movie version, if I was to do Knots Landing, which was the spin-off of Dallas, meets the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you'd be like, oh, okay, I get that. Lots of people in the cul-de-sac would be chopped up in a kind of a 90-minute period. So the easier you can compartmentalise your marketing for audiences, the quicker a reaction you'll get at the box office. It doesn't always work, of course, but this was one of the first times it happened. Both films were very successful. A third film was planned, and there's been lots of talk about that recently. But I think, had Milton not done this, then perhaps the boom in television sitcoms and dramas hitting cinemas perhaps wouldn't have happened, and certainly not as quickly.
How successful were they in terms of kind of today's numbers? Do you have the figures?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're in the book as well. The first film went top 10, so if that was in today's top 10, you'd be expecting to make somewhere between sort of 40 and 60 million pounds in the UK. And the films kind of travelled well too. They were about a quarter of the budget of Doctor No, and yet they had kind of large production values as well. And they were shooting on Stage H Shepperton, which was quite hallowed ground because 2001 had filmed there and lots of other sort of great movies. And we kind of delve into the politics of how they managed to get Stage H as well, because of course with such a tiny budget you can only film somewhere like that when no one else wants it, which is the winter months. And so if you are doing a feature film, you'll know for booking equipment and lights and crew as well, film in the darkness of winter, because you'll get better deals. There'll be more crew to choose from too. It's the harsh light of the summer, the long days, when people still think they can save money on lighting because it's long days. I don't know why people think that. People are less available. And I've always, Jamie, traditionally tried to shoot in the winter because I'm a kind of a winter person and I like to edit in the winter as well. In the summer, I kind of go into a sort of pre-production hibernation. I think it's my pale skin, probably.
That makes two of us.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Well, we could make vampire films together, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned as well that the films kind of divided fans when you mentioned this in the book, and they saw it as unofficial and not canon. But this, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, I'm not great on Doctor Who history, but would this have been the first attempt for Doctor Who to kind of be pushed to an American market as well? Because I saw that there was a mention of the Dell comic, which of course sat alongside this to kind of push the film in the States.
Yes, so Peter Cushing was cast specifically because he was a marquee name in America. He was recognised for this type and this genre of film. Milton, of course, had worked with him before, Milton Subotsky, the producer. So yes, eyes to America for sure. And of course, they wanted to create a different family vibe. So Milton summed it up by calling it the Swiss Family Robinson, which is a much more, if you like, a Waltons approach. So if you remember the Waltons as being quite wholesome television where drama would take place, but in a quite a safe environment. So even though there's Daleks killing people, Milton wanted it to be kind of accessible for all families and to have no tricky backstory about being a Time Lord with two hearts with a TARDIS that's stolen, because that's a felony in the United States. So to have a cleaner lineage for the film would make it an easier sell. And whilst I think he could have cast William Hartnell and it would have been a great film too, I think Peter Cushing brings his own sort of energy to it. And both films were successful. The second one, which cost more, was less successful because the thrill of seeing Daleks in colour and in Techniscope, in widescreen, wasn't as big a thrill as the first film. And then the third film, which was based on the Dalek adventure, The Chase, didn't happen. And then years later, Milton tried to get the rights again, and things didn't turn out quite as well.
Yeah, you talk about the kind of softer approach of this, of the feel of this movie. I mean, I associate Doctor Who. I mean, I was born in '76, so I grew up, with Peter Davidson and Tom Baker and people like that. So my association with Doctor Who is that typical running behind the sofa and hiding away and running out of the room even when the Cybermen or the Daleks appeared. But this Doctor, rather than being this eccentric kind of, no holds barred kind of character, he's more of a grandfatherly character, which probably is why the fans didn't enjoy it and continued to not enjoy it through this sort of 80s and 90s and 2000s. But now it's sort of been reframed, hasn't it? And I'm sure your book will help do that as well. It's kind of been reframed as an interesting aside, perhaps, but still very much part of the Doctor Who canon. Yeah,
so bringing it into, as it were, the family of the official fandom has been tricky. So Doctor Who itself has been sort of renamed. You're either Classic Who, so the original television Doctors from William Hartnell to Sylvester McCoy, and then you have the kind of the holding Who, which is Paul McGann when he's done the television movie, and then of course you kick back off with Russell T Davis's Doctor Who, and then Stephen Moffat, the producer, took over. Stephen Moffat said when he took over as Doctor Who that he was a big fan of the Cushing films, and I think that gave permission for people like me who were genuine TV Doctor Who fans to feel relieved and say, I can come out of the closet and say I actually am also a Peter Cushing fan. And to sort of, there's a quote from Stephen Moffat in the book where he talks at some length about it. But to nail his colours, he actually painted the inside doors of the TARDIS white to match the inside doors of the TARDIS from the movie, from Invasion Earth. And you see that on Matt Smith's TARDIS when he first appears on screen as the Doctor. So I think Time and the new series, critics of the new series as well, because you'll always find critics. People complained when Peter Davison took over because he was too young and too blonde, and how could he be the Doctor? And of course, fans love him now. But as fans kind of gather their pitchforks for current versions of the Doctor, Peter Cushing has been kind of gathered in with William Hartnell as being one of the original Doctors, and of course he isn't. But I think love for the film, the fact that Studio Canal have done this rather extravagant double 4K box release, steel books as well as special editions. I did a couple of unboxing videos. If people want to check out my channel Walsh Bros on YouTube, you can see those. And I contributed. They'd done a mini version of that. They'd done like a Lilliputian version of my book, squeezed down into I think half a dozen pages. It's basically an advert for the book, which is kind of fun. They did a similar thing on Flash Gordon as well. So, the market has changed in terms of people's taste for this film, people's admiration for Peter's performance, and a willingness to pay money now when they wouldn't have done, say, in the 70s and 80s. So if you want to buy, if you can still get it, the special edition box set for each film, they're each £50, and you get the 4K restoration and lots of other bits and bobs. Great collectible pieces. You can't imagine saying that to someone 20 years ago, that in 2022, the Peter Cushing Doctor Who films, we're going to, imagine my imaginary cigar, I reckon £50 each. And it's like, really? What about some episodes of Crossroads while you're at it? Maybe we can get £50 for those. It's like, who'd have thought this market, whilst the DVD market itself has shrunk to almost nothing at all, you can't find them necessarily in supermarkets, and you don't rent them from your newsagents and so on. They've gone the way of VHS. A new market has emerged where you buy one film that looks like the size of a house brick, and whether it's Dune or Legend, which I've recently bought, or these fabulous films from Studio Canal. There's the Doctor Who's, Flash Gordon, the Lady Killers in 4K. Who'd have thought that would happen? Total Recall, Basic Instinct. And it's not because it's a vanity project for the rights holder. It's because there is a market for people to come back yet again. You said you saw it on Channel 4. I mean, I bought it on VHS, on DVD, on Blu-ray. And just when I have enough money that I can have anything I want, they give me free ones for this. But I would have bought them, of course I would have done, for this version. So I think that says a lot about the longevity of a project, if people will buy it on multiple formats. And I think now the hard edges around the criticisms of this film and how it relates to Doctor Who have been softened over the years. People have become older, and I think they've recognised the struggles that this film had to get made and why it exists. And is it better to have it than not? And I think if we were to run a Twitter poll on it, people would say yes, better than not.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it, what's happened with the DVD and the physical Blu-ray market is that, streaming came along and everyone just sort of, I know people that literally took their DVD and Blu-ray collections to the local dump and just handed them over and said, well, it's all going to be online now and I can get any film I want at any time. And now it seems to be, it's come sort of full circle, hasn't it, where people are thinking, well, actually, if I want that movie, which isn't on Netflix or Disney Plus or Hulu or whatever else, or Amazon, then I need it. I need it in my hand and I need it on my shelf. And in many ways, I've heard collectors of DVDs and Blu-rays talk about it as almost like a preservation project for themselves, to create a library, because how else am I going to see this movie in 10 or 15 years time? Because as we know, Netflix will show something and then they'll retire it. If it's an exclusive, they'll retire it and you'll never see it again.
Yeah, I think so, and it's younger people are buying into this as well. And we talk about, VHSs are coming back. There's collectors clubs. There's vinyl, of course, has been revived there for many years. And I think if it's special enough, people will pay for it. I think what people are less interested in is just a standard release. They want something more and something special, and something that upgrades the image and the sound. And of course, the thing that people most want to see are deleted scenes, and the way in which workflows were created pre sort of 1975 for films that were physically cut as neg cuts and answer prints and work prints and so on. It's highly unlikely that there would be any trims left, and if there were trims, they won't necessarily be canned up in the library with camera negs or interposes. So we have to do what we can and just hope that that one day people might find them. But until that happens, getting the very best quality and going 4K. But unlike Blu-ray, where people have that machine, you need a new machine for this. And if you don't have a 4K television, then you won't see it in as good quality. So I think it's always a big risk to ask people to upgrade equipment so that they can see the film they've got in better quality. And of course, for this film to make it to 4K before Doctor No, which was also from that era, is quite surprising. And I've noticed that on Prime Video, they've got the Bond catalogue there in UHD, which is wonderful to see. But they haven't had commercial 4K UHD disc releases. And there's an argument as to whether or not... I mean, I have a couple of films on Prime and they look fine, but people talk about the compression rates as well. And not just in terms of yourself as a consumer watching on your telly, but also the compression rate on servers as they try and basically ingest 4 and 8K material for consumers. And the picture quality is pretty good, but sometimes if you were to do a side-by-side comparison, if you had two tellies, if you were like a Bond villain and lived with two massive 4K tellies and had a disc in one and a streaming service on the other, then you could kind of compare and contrast. But that's the dream, isn't it? To live underground like a Bond villain.
With a cat on your lap, yeah. One of the things you've done as well with the book, talking of restoration, of course, is you found these wonderful photographs, and many which haven't seen the light of day for decades. That must be a thrill to go through and find these things, these artifacts, and think to yourself, as a huge Doctor Who fan, wow, I've never seen this before. I'm excited, so I know that the people who are going to buy the book are excited.
Well, the first thing a publisher always says to me when I pitch a book is they're like, well, that's great, that's a good story, but are there the assets? Are there the images that you can put in here, the photos, the paintings and whatnot? And in this case, Studio Canal helped me because their archive is quite vast. They had wonderful photographs, some of which had never been published before, and many of which hadn't been seen in that quality before. So the 8x10s that were sent often as black and white prints from colour film to newspapers are what survive today in most archives. And they're here in blisteringly good quality and in a wider frame format as well, because just to give people an idea, that the video that we're looking at now is more or less Academy ratio. It's a sort of an 8x10 frame that a photograph would be received by newspaper. So it's sort of an oblong. And it's sort of the standard ratio that you might get a widescreen telly, 1:8:5. Well, medium format is a much squarer format, and it's what old wedding photography would be created on, and it's perfect square. But these pictures are often cropped into a sort of a more Academy format for newspapers, so we got hold of those. And in some instances, we actually had them colourised as well by the great Clayton Hickman, who's a former Doctor Who magazine editor and does the best colourisations of classic photos from Doctor Who and across the board. He's done Rockstar photos too. And I'm supremely grateful to him for doing some key images here in this book that are going to be seen for the very first time. And, you say, was I excited to see pictures? I had to stop writing because fans would give me things. And often they were pictures I already have, which was cool. But if they weren't, and if they were very special, and just as an example of this very special pictures, there's a behind the scenes of a Dalek with his head being taken off there in the book. And there's two kind of technicians with him. And I had to say to Titan Books, please don't issue that photo to the public at large. I need to see that in the book, please, because when I saw that picture I had to stop writing for nearly an hour because I sat in the seats, kept looking at the picture, kept getting up again, kept making safety copies of it because I was so excited to see it, because I've read everything around these films. I've been buying Doctor Who magazines since the late 1970s when it came out as a weekly, so I've seen all of the photographs and I've seen everything that's around. I've obsessed over the DVD extras and looked at the libraries and images and so on, so I had a good idea of what has been widely seen. And the problem, Jamie, I have for the book is this: it's only it's like 160 or so pages. I wanted to do two books. I wanted to do one on one film, one on the other, sure, and put them in a Dalek kind of gate sleeve. And had I pushed for that, the books wouldn't have happened, because commercially these books are very expensive to create. They need to sell in volume. But I would love to have had a bigger book. But what would you do? Do you publish the photo that people know quite well, that's in really good quality, or do you publish a photo which is not quite as good, where maybe one of the actors is blinking or has got one of their eyes closed by accident, that hasn't been published before? So it's a real dilemma, isn't it? You want people to see things they haven't seen before, but you want to represent the films as best quality. What would Milton Sabotsky do if he was here? what would he be saying about which pictures? That's a great picture of Peter there. That's a great picture of Roberta Tovey there. Don't show the Daleks being taken apart because it ruins the magic. So you kind of think all producers, particularly Dino De Laurentiis, he forbade loads of on-set photography because he didn't really want people seeing behind the curtain. So of course that doesn't help me when I'm coming along to do my books on Flash or on Conan, because I want those, as you do, you want to see behind the curtain. That's the whole point of these books.
Yeah, I always want to see those photos that are like the iconic one that but with that might have been a few frames earlier or a few frames later when they were shooting it, like you say, with the actor pulling a slightly different face, because immediately you think, hang on, no, that is different, and it retains your attention on that page. What I also like about what you do in your books is you sort of dig out these interesting insights and facts. Like for instance, I had no idea that Peter Cushing was also offered Doctor Who as a TV role twice. So he could well have been that second Doctor Who, or much later on he was offered as well, wasn't he? And how did you come across that information? Or is that widely known?
Some of that's widely known. Some of it was from unpublished interviews. Bernard Cribbins he pitched himself for the role, but his agent put him up for it in the 70s. And I spoke to Bernard at a Doctor Who 50th anniversary event at the Excel Centre when various doctors came together. And I always scurry off to the green room where there's loads of free food. And that's where he was, and we kind of sat down and chatted. I said to him, I want to do a book on the movies, and we were chatting about the politics of publishing and so on. But actors often get offered things at the wrong time in their lives, and there was a certain point when being offered television if you were a cinema actor, or being offered cinema when you were a theatre actor, could have been seen as somewhat of a step down or an insult. Ron Moody was famously offered the role when Pat Troughton left, and also when John Pertwee left. Of course, Ron Moody is one of the great cinema and theatre actors. He was in Oliver, the musical. Bernard Cribbins, as I say, was offered it. Lots of different people have been offered Doctor Who and either said no or weren't available at the time. And it's always been a tricky one to cast. I think Peter would have been great. The question would have been, would he have returned to his original incarnation? But I think now that he knew, you can be reincarnated, they could have created a wonderful storyline for him as the Doctor. And, I grew up at a similar time as yourself. I always thought the Doctor can never be too old. And rather controversially, I do think he can be too young, although all of the Doctors are fabulous, of course they are. But I always thought that an older Doctor is always a good thing. I always thought that if there was ever a movie version again, maybe Donald Sutherland in the kind of late 80s or early 90s, he was like Doctor Who in Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1978. Yes. He's got the curly hair. He's like a Canadian Tom Baker. Yeah. There's just everything about him just feels like this is the Doctor Who movie. And he even has a companion. If people haven't seen the Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1978, do track that down, because that's the Doctor Who film that could have been. So is Life Force. People hate me for saying this, but Life Force from 1985 from Tobe Hooper. You've got Frank Finlay in there. He's like Doctor Who. The whole thing feels like a bit like Quatermass. So there's been lots of nearly could have been Doctor Who films out there and actors. But I think Peter would have been marvellous.
I think there's, as you said, there's so many people that have been offered that role, but I bet there's only a very small minority that don't regret it. I'm sure everyone, having seen the success since then, has kind of grown to regret their choice, perhaps. Another of the things that's interesting is, I always think about this thing about budget versus production values and the stuff they were trying to do, and also working with the censors as well, that the Daleks, they weren't able to have the shooting rays like you might have expected from, I don't know, Forbidden Planet or something. They had to go with fire extinguishers. So there's always that balance, isn't there? And you talk about that in the book too.
Yeah, so if to animate the Dalek rays would have been fiercely expensive. On television, it's slightly easier because you can create it as a video effect. and either do it live on set or do what they did in the original Doctor Who. They used to turn the picture into a negative and back and forth as the exterminate, and the picture would go like that. But to actually see lasers coming out of the tip of a Dalek whilst the Dalek is moving as well, that's a whole animation job. And if you've got lots of Daleks firing at lots of people, and also you have to have the end points where the lasers are hitting. So what Milton originally wanted to do was to use flamethrowers, if you can believe it. And it was just like, really? I mean, that set was plastic. There was so much hairspray on everyone. Jenny Linden said to me that she was like 50% hairspray for that entire production, because she had this wonderful beehive hairdo, which, although her costume went through different sort of stresses and strains, her wonderful hair stayed immaculately in place. But firing, it's just so dangerous. Anyone who's used flamethrowers on set today know what an enormous kerfuffle it is. It's much easier to do it digitally, because you have to have fire master with you, you have to have fire brigade on standby, the room has to be checked by everyone, you have to do a really deep risk assessment and everything. So they settled on the which was still actually quite dangerous themselves, the fire extinguishers, because they let off a lot of gas as well, because effectively it's like a giant aerosol. If anyone's ever accidentally breathed in deodorant, they'll know that it's actually quite an unpleasant experience. So there was that aspect to it, but also there's something called peril and threat, which sound like a kind of a double act, don't they? She's on the piano and he's on the fiddle. But peril and threat are what censors are looking for, because when you get to a family level film, and Ray Harryhausen had this quite a lot as well. I'm a trustee of the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation for people who maybe haven't seen me before. Why haven't they seen me before? They should be following me online. On Jason and the Argonauts, I've just done an unboxing video for a skeleton from Jason and the Argonauts. And in that I talk about the fact that originally the skeletons were to be disturbed inside hell. So basically they guarded the entrance to hell along with the seven-headed Hydra, and these dead soldiers' graves were disturbed at the entrance to hell, and out they came at night and fought with Jason around the Golden Fleece and the Hydra. The censors read the script and said, look, if you want to go for the family certification for this is way too much peril and trauma and drama and risk. So you need to pare that back. It can't be at the entrance to hell. It'll need to be at a more twilight or daylight time. And so filmmakers work with the censors, or the film classifiers as they're called today, to ensure that they're not filming things that they'll then have to dispose of at great expense to try and get that U certificate. Because even a PG sometimes can limit audience friendliness, because back in the day in the 60s, children would pop along to the cinemas by themselves and in they go. And if it's a U certificate, people can pop in and you don't have any worries. But I think both of these films really skate around the edges, particularly the second film. There are knife fights and knife deaths in there. I mean, if you were going into the future, 2150 AD, you'd have to wear a stab vest, because there was so much throwing knives and robo-men. So I'm surprised that film has survived that certification. So I think it's always a pull and push you with the censors, but it's not always done in a kind of an aggressive way. Sometimes producers like to tell the story of how I had the big fight with the censors, and it's not. It's normally an admin discussion where a script is submitted before filming. And Ray Harryhausen did it, and Milton Subotsky, of course, did it, because when you're working on lower budgets, you cannot afford to have reams and reams of scenes that may have cost hundreds of thousands to mount to just be gone. Because the studio is expecting a certain certificate, and if you've delivered something that isn't, that's your fault. It's not the censor's fault. That's you as the producer. So you have to watch for that.
It's funny, isn't it, thinking back to some of the other U certificates. I mean, I always think of Star Wars as a weird one. I remember showing my girls for the first time Star Wars, and they were saying, and it gets to that part with Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru's skeletons, outside the homestead burning away, and Luke looking on. My kid said, this was a U? How did that happen? But it's funny sometimes the things that kind of slip through the net as well. It was interesting to read as well that they would have to remove things like screams in these movies as well, because that would be seen as something that the censors might frown upon as well, the reaction to the peril.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think when we think of Star Wars, of course, the arm comes off in the cantina. But I think you're right about the uncle and aunts, because they're human characters and they're paternal characters as well, aren't they? So to see them in that state is really quite shocking. And yet Empire Strikes Back has moments, doesn't it? There's decapitations. There's a Tauntaun being slit open. Clash of the Titans has really brutal scenes of the hand coming off Calabos and Medusa being decapitated. However, the British censors were concerned about the decapitation. The American censors were concerned because you can see her breasts.
Of course, always. The Americans are always worried about those things. It's bizarre, isn't it?
And so if you read the kind of the notes from the Motion Picture Association of America, that is the concern. And Ray even did some kind of artwork and tests with her wearing kind of a rag sort of piece around the top, because he was concerned he didn't want to have to reframe the scene, and you couldn't reshoot the scene. That wasn't going to be practical. But I think because the film was released through MGM and it had a very big budget, I sometimes think that bigger films are given a bit of a pass. That's me speculating there. But it's crazy, isn't it? We have a different view of sex and violence. In Europe, sex is considered to be more of a thing that happens, don't you know? Whereas in America, it's something to be frowned upon.
When you write these books, you know, you say you've got the official archive of Studio Canal, but also you want to frame it, you want to put it in some kind of context. So you talk about, you know, Doctor Who, the BBC, you talk about Dalek Mania. Where do you go to get those stories? What are you delving into? Is there a personal collection that you've got, or are you kind of encouraging fans, or are you going on eBay and buying old magazines and books?
It's mostly my own collection of books and memories of Doctor Who, and I check with fans who have more knowledge than myself. And so people who've been great helps, like Ian Wheeler at the Doctor Who Appreciation Society, help put me in touch with some people. And there are questions you have that have different answers. So Roberta Tovey, who played Susan in both films, she didn't think it was true that Peter Cushing was unwell in the second film, and she thought there might be another reason. Other cast members said that there was a row with Milton Subotsky, and that seemed really unlikely to me. But these things kind of percolate when there's a kind of desert of official facts. Well, I got hold of the official insurance paperwork and the completion guarantee people, Film Finances, and I was able to see that Peter was unwell. Not surprising, he'd got a form of pneumonia. I dare say working in Shepperton Stage H in the height of a 1960s winter, which were bleak and harsh. There was no heating on those stages, except through the lights themselves. So there was an insurance claim. We go into that in the book. So that kind of detail fascinates me, and the technical stuff as well about shooting in Techniscope. But the Dalek Mania stuff, there was particular collectors who helped me with photography and some fact checking as well, because you can go online and into other books, but you need to be if you find two versions of something with different facts attached, that's a problem, you know. And if it's a well-known date for something in history, then, you know, there's no disputing the Great Fire of London and 1066 and so on. But if you are looking at something which is kind of fact light and there's lots of fan interpretation, you do need to be sure what you're saying is correct, because it's the official version. And there might even be people that pick me up on some of what we've written here, but Studio Canal have signed off on this book. And for them, it's not simply a case of checking the grammar and checking that I've included all the acknowledgements. It is making sure that this is a library title, that I'm saying things that are appropriate, that are true, and that I can back up with interviews or with photography. So it's more of a documentary for me than it is an essay. And I know in the past people have written books, and sometimes, you know, film institutes will write books which you'll think, oh, I get that on Blade Runner, and you have a look through it and you'll be like, oh, I'm none the wiser, because someone has just pontificated through, you know, maybe 100 or so pages with no real decent photos about what the film meant to them. And it's like, okay, well, great, but that doesn't give me a more in-depth or a more rounded view. So in some ways I try and detach myself as a fanboy from the story I'm telling. I am trying to get through to the official version. And all my years as a documentary filmmaker have taught me to kind of be separate. I mean, even once I was a subject of my own documentary, and I separated myself away in the edits so that I didn't do like a vanity project. So I always bring that sensibility to everything and hope that we've made the right choices in terms of content, in terms of chapters. If I had written 2 books, there'd be more stuff in there. There'd be more photos, but not necessarily ones that are better than what's there. So I think the great thing about this having 2 films in one book is it distills it down to the best of what you need to see to understand the story of these films. So I'm hoping for hardcore fans, they'll find new stuff. And for people who are maybe just Doctor Who fans and didn't know there were movies, then for them it'll be an Aladdin's cave of facts and photos.
And when you publish this book and it's on the shelf, do you get a bit of a thrill walking past, Waterstones or walking past the BFI bookshop or somewhere like that and seeing it on the shelf there?
I always do, Jamie. It's always exciting to have a book and to go to your own book signing and so on. And I'm always thrilled when they sell well. I mean, the reason this book should have come out in September, and it didn't because it sold out. So when it went on as a pre-sale to Amazon and other online book retailers, it sold out the initial print run. So they decided to increase the print run and push the publishing date back to the end of 2022, November 25th, 2022. So that was thrilling. I was kind of relieved that people were prepared to buy it on face value of the cover. They're judging the book by the cover. I think there's a couple of interior pictures on Amazon for you to tease customers. But then, of course, the worry sets in is, I hope they're not going to be disappointed that they bought this book 6 months in advance. But that book and all of the others, to see them sat on shelves is wonderful. And Escape from New York has gone to a Japanese language version.
Great.
There's a French and German version coming too. Flash Gordon has gone to a 2nd edition, and there's some new pictures because we found some stuff we couldn't put in the first one. And there's a great quote from Mike Hodges on the back, because Mike did a sit down with me when he got the book and talked about it. So the opportunity for the 2nd edition to add a few bits and bobs for people who've maybe missed it first time. It's frustrating because you don't want people who bought it the first time to think, I paid £35 for that, and now you've got some new pictures in it. What can you do? You want to make it as good as you can, and I'm grateful that the publisher will allow it to be a living, breathing thing where we can do more things. And I do book plates. If people can't come to book signings, there will be book signings for Doctor Who. I'll post them a free book plate and a bookmark. We have I can show you exclusively what the bookmark looks like. Look at that. Ooh,
yes.
Look at that quality card. So it's you can see the book on the front, and then on the back, sneaky peek of one of the restored pictures. That was originally black and white, and Clayton Hickman has really time travelled for us.
Amazing. You wouldn't know if you'd not pointed that out. I would not have known at all. Some colorization, you kind of go, it's not quite as consistent as it should be, and it looks kind of odd. But I must say, he's done a fantastic job there.
Well, there's a few in the book that they're going to knock people's socks off, and because they knocked my socks off, so I'm super grateful that Clayton travelled back in time for us using his digits to recreate the colour photography. So that's really wonderful.
Just to finish with then, John, what's next for you? You talked about the Conan book. Have you got? I mean, I'm not asking you to read out your list of of books that are forthcoming or projects that are forthcoming, but you got things going on at the moment?
I've walked myself into 3 more books, and it's because I have these conversations where people say, would you like to? And I'm like, yeah, I would, yeah. And suddenly then like a deal memo turns up, or because I manage all I don't go through agents, I manage my own stuff through my own company. So I'm kind of, yeah, okay. And before you know it, I've agreed to 3 books so far. And I had a conversation with the publisher there last year in the summer, and they said, do you have like a list or something? And I said, I happen to have a list in table format with the studios, the years, the dates, and everything in datal order, not in preference order. So I kind of fired it through, and that's going to keep me busy till I'm a very old man, I suspect. If they can get this is the thing that needs to come together. They have to be able to get those rights, because some rights are unavailable. Studios have to agree to allow a book to be written. And then you have to find out if there's enough assets to create this format of book. So once you strip through those variables, there's only a few titles left standing. And what do fans want? I want this book, and it turns out luckily fans do. But would somebody want a book about this film or that film? And if you think of films that haven't had those movie book experiences, you'll think, oh, maybe no one really wants Flash Gordon or Escape from New York. And I kind of thought maybe I'm walking into something here because maybe no one does. But so far, fingers crossed, we've not made a mistake. But there are films that have been unsuccessful that I think do deserve books. And this is the tricky one for publishers who will look at a film and go, well, that was a massive box office flop at the time. And I'll be like, yeah, but I like Howard the Duck. And I know Phil Tippett and I know the people that worked on it. And it's now got more of a, I won't say a prestige, but it's got more of a following than it did have when it came out in the mid-80s. And there is lots of assets that would work in a book for that. Not everyone would buy it. But it's not like the Bible. You don't have to get everyone to buy it. You just need enough people to make sure it pays for itself.
I think we'll end it there. I think that's perfect. Yeah, I won't clutter the airwaves with saying my finishing lines there. But no, that's great. I would buy that book, John. I really would.
Well, I hope you include that in the
podcast
because everyone's saying, "Oh, John Walsh he's ruined what little credibility he had by saying he'd write Howard the Duck."
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat with John Walsh there. The book is out 25th of November. I've had a chance to read a version that's been sent out to reviewers. So I've seen the PDF of it, but I'm looking forward to getting my hands on a copy for a friend of mine who's a big Doctor Who nerd. So I think she's going to enjoy that. See if you can buy it as well from a more independent bookshop. Help them out as well as helping John and his publisher out. So the next 2 episodes will be my chat with Jim Bloom, ex-Lucasfilm ILM employee, talking about his work with and without George Lucas, that is. One will be episode 61, October's second podcast, so just in a day or two from now. The second part will be episode 62, November's first episode. And as I said in the intro, I also have VFX legend Dennis Muren coming on, as well as Battlestar Galactica composer Stu Phillips. So plenty more on the way. Plus the announcement for the Kickstarter campaign for my first feature-length documentary. If you like things that swim in the sea, eye patches and flying saucers, you might be interested. Anyway, I can't wait to show you what we've got lined up. I'm so excited about it, and I really hope you can help with the Kickstarter and get it all moving, because we really are absolutely dying to get this thing finished. If you'd like to support the podcast, it's a very independent podcast. It's just me, my laptop, and a guest. Then you can do so at patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Jamie Benning, JamieBenning. And for as little as $1 a month, you could really help contribute to the continuation of this film history podcast. Several people who've joined recently have just paid for a year, which is fantastic because that just gives me $12 or whatever. And it enables me to kind of put some real effort into this and keep the standard high and keep the focus on it as well. So thanks to everyone that supports me, whether it's via Patreon or retweeting or liking or sharing, and just talking about it and letting me know your thoughts as well. I always enjoy hearing back from you. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.